The first time Daiichi broke a man's arm, he was 17. The second time, 18. By 28, nobody counted anymore. What they remembered instead was the sound, or rather, the absence of it. A Yakuza enforcer who never spoke, never shouted, never even grunted when he worked. Just the wet crack of bone, the gasp of his victims, and the terrible silence that followed, thick as blood. His father, Masaru, had learned to read his son's violence the way other men read newspapers. A tilted head meant warning, clenched fists meant execution. Daiichi was the family's most efficient tool, and tools don't need voices. But tools can break. It started small. Daiichi began attacking strangers without provocation. A businessman on the subway, a teenager at a convenience store, an elderly woman waiting for a bus. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was personal. Just sudden, brutal violence followed by that suffocating silence, as if Daiichi was trying to scream through his fists. The psychiatrist Masaru hired said it was trauma manifesting as rage. The enforcer he consulted said Daiichi needed better targets. His mother, before she died 5 years ago, would have said he needed love. But Masaru was a Yakuza boss. He understood only one language: control. So he did what made sense in his world. He confined Daiichi to the family restaurant, a small izakaya in Shinjuku, that served as both legitimate business and meeting ground for the organization. Daiichi would work the back kitchen, away from customers, away from strangers he might destroy. It was a cage disguised as employment. For 3 months it worked. Daiichi chopped vegetables with the same mechanical precision he once applied to violence. He moved through the kitchen like a ghost, present, but not alive. The other staff learned not to make eye contact. His father visited twice, nodded at the arrangement, and left satisfied. Then Sakura arrived. She was hired on a Tuesday, recommended by someone's cousin who knew someone. Shai didn't begin to describe her. She moved through the restaurant like she was apologizing for taking up space, her voice barely above a whisper when she spoke to customers. She was 26, with dark eyes that seemed to hold entire conversations she was too afraid to have out loud. The other waitresses called her the Ghost because she had a habit of appearing beside your table without you noticing. On her third shift, she made a mistake. She brought the wrong order to a table of mid-level Yakuza members, men with scars and that particular coldness that comes from having hurt people professionally. They laughed at her, not kindly. One grabbed her wrist. She didn't pull away. She just stood there, trembling, whispering apologies. Daiichi saw it from the kitchen window. He moved without thinking. Or perhaps he was always thinking, always watching, always waiting for an excuse. He came through the swinging doors like something released from a cage. The Yakuza member barely had time to register his presence before Daiichi's hand closed around his throat. The others reached for weapons, but they were too slow. Daiichi was always too fast, too precise, too utterly without mercy. But then something impossible happened. Sakura stepped between them. Not between Daiichi and the Yakuza member, between Daiichi and the violence itself. She placed her small hand on his chest, and she did something that stopped time. She signed. Her fingers moved in quick, deliberate patterns. Japanese sign language. Slow down. Breathe. You're safe. The words formed in the air like a prayer, and Daiichi, violent, mute, broken Daiichi, stopped. He actually stopped. The Yakuza member scrambled away, confused and humiliated. His friends followed. The restaurant fell silent except for the soft clink of glasses and the low murmur of conversations resuming. Daiichi stood frozen, staring at Sakura's hands, at her face, at this small woman who had just disarmed him with fingers instead of force. "I learned sign language from my grandmother," she whispered, her voice even quieter than usual. "She was deaf. I thought maybe you might want someone to talk to, someone who understands silence." Daiichi had never cried. Not when his mother died. Not when his father first made him hurt someone. Not in all the years of violence and control and the terrible, suffocating quiet that lived inside his chest. But standing in that izakaya, watching Sakura's hands fall slowly to her sides, he felt something crack open inside him. Something that had been sealed shut since childhood. He reached out slowly, carefully, as if approaching something wild and wounded. His hand found hers. He signed back, his movements rusty, but deliberate. Thank you. Antes de continuar com esta história incrível que chegou até mim, se inscreve no canal, deixa aquele like porque isso realmente ajuda, e me diz nos comentários de onde você está me ouvindo agora. Às vezes, acho que certas histórias encontram as pessoas certas nos lugares certos. Bem, voltando àquela noite na vida de Daichi e Sakura. After that night, everything changed, but not in the way anyone expected. Daichi didn't stop being dangerous. That wasn't something you could unlearn like a language, or forget like a bad dream. But he stopped attacking strangers. Instead, he began arriving at the restaurant earlier each day, leaving later. He started taking shifts in the dining area, something Masaru had explicitly forbidden. His father noticed immediately. "What are you doing?" Masaru asked one evening, finding his son clearing tables with methodical care. Daichi didn't answer. He never did. But he signed, "Working." It was technically true. It was also a lie so complete it bordered on poetry. What Daichi was actually doing was learning. Every shift, he watched Sakura move through the restaurant. He observed how she remembered customers' names, how she anticipated their needs before they voiced them, how she managed to be invisible and indispensable simultaneously. She was fluent in a language he was only beginning to understand, the language of connection without words. Sakura, for her part, was terrified. She'd grown up in a world where silence meant safety, where invisibility was survival. Her grandmother had been deaf, yes, but more than that. Her grandmother had been the only person in her family who truly listened. When everyone else was shouting, her grandmother's silence had been the only place Sakura could breathe. Learning sign language as a child hadn't been an act of love, though it became one. It had been an act of escape. Now, working beside Daichi, she found herself in a different kind of silence. Not the suffocating kind that came from violence or fear, but something else. Something that felt almost like understanding. One night after closing, Daichi found her crying in the storage room. She was sitting on a crate of beer bottles, her shoulders shaking silently. He stood in the doorway, unsure of what to do. In his world, tears meant weakness. Weakness meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant death. But Sakura wasn't in his world anymore. She was in a different one. One where sadness could exist without being punished. He sat beside her. Not too close. Not threatening. Just present. After a long moment, he signed. "What happened?" "My grandmother died," Sakura whispered. 3 years ago. Today would have been her birthday. Daichi was quiet for a long time. Then he signed, "Tell me about her." So Sakura did. She told him about a woman who had lived in a world of silence and had somehow made it beautiful. She told him about learning to sign before she learned to speak, about how her grandmother's hands moved like music, about how she'd been the only person in her family who never made Sakura feel like she needed to apologize for existing. "She used to say that silence wasn't empty," Sakura said, her voice steadier now. "She said it was full of things other people couldn't hear. She said the world was too loud, and she was lucky to have an excuse to step out of it." Daichi listened, really listened, in a way he'd never been able to listen before. And when Sakura finished, he did something that surprised them both. He took her hand and placed it over his heart. "I understand," he signed with his free hand. "I live in silence too. But it's not beautiful. It's a prison. Maybe," Sakura said softly, "we could make it beautiful together." The weeks that followed were strange and tender in ways neither of them had anticipated. Daichi began teaching Sakura more sign language. Not the basic phrases she already knew, but the deeper vocabulary. The words for emotions that didn't have simple translations. The signs for concepts like longing, redemption, the specific pain of being trapped inside your own mind. In return, Sakura taught him something equally valuable. She taught him that silence could be a choice rather than a sentence. They developed their own language, one that existed in the space between words. A tilt of the head. A particular way of breathing. The way Sakura would place her hand on his arm when he grew too tense, and he would immediately relax. The way Daichi would position himself between Sakura and any potential threat, not out of violence, but out of protection. Masaru noticed, of course. He noticed everything. One evening, he called Daichi into his private office above the restaurant. "The girl," he said without preamble. "Sakura." Daichi's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "She's a distraction," Masaru continued. "You're becoming soft. I've received 3 complaints this week about you refusing to handle situations. 3. This isn't like you." Daichi signed. "I'm done." "Done?" Masaru's voice was dangerously quiet. "You're done? You don't get to be done, boy. You are Yakuza. You are my son. You do what I tell you to do." "I'm done hurting people," Daichi signed, his movements sharp and deliberate. "I'm done being your weapon." Masaru stood up slowly. He was an older man now, but he still carried the weight of his position like armor. "If you walk away from this family, you walk away from everything. Your name, your home, your protection, you'll be nothing. Worse than nothing, you'll be a liability, and liabilities get eliminated." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the casual certainty of a man who had spent 40 years in a world where such things were simply how business was conducted. Daichi stood up too. He was taller than his father, broader, stronger. But strength had never been the currency that mattered in this family. Obedience was. "Then I'll be nothing," Daichi signed. "But I won't be your nothing anymore." He turned and walked out of the office. His father didn't stop him. That was the most terrifying part, the complete absence of surprise or resistance. It meant Masaru had already decided what would happen next. Daichi had perhaps 48 hours before his father decided he was a loose end that needed tying up. Daichi told Sakura everything that night. They sat in the small apartment he'd rented years ago, a place his father didn't know about. One of the few things in his life that was truly his own. He signed slowly, carefully, making sure she understood every word. "My father will kill me. Or have me killed. It's the only way he knows how to handle betrayal." Sakura's hands trembled as she signed back. "Then we run. Tonight. Right now." But Daichi shook his head. "It doesn't work that way. In my world, running just delays the inevitable. He has resources. He has reach. He has people everywhere." "Then what do we do?" Sakura's voice cracked. For the first time since they'd met, Daichi saw real fear in her eyes. Not the quiet, internalized fear she usually carried, but something raw and desperate. He pulled her close and signed against her shoulder, his hands moving in the space between them. "We make a choice. Together. We either disappear completely, or we make him understand that killing me costs more than letting me go." "How?" Sakura pulled back to look at him. "How do we make a Yakuza boss understand anything?" Daichi was quiet for a long moment. Then he signed. "We use what he values most. Information. Leverage. The thing that keeps him in power." What Daichi didn't tell her was that this plan would require him to betray not just his father, but the entire organization. It would require him to go to the police, to the prosecutors, to provide testimony about decades of crimes. It would require him to become the one thing a Yakuza member could never become: a rat. But he also knew something else. His father had enemies. Powerful enemies. Men who had been waiting for years for someone close to Masaru to slip up, to provide the evidence they needed to take him down. Daichi had access to that evidence. He had spent his entire life in his father's world, learning its secrets, its vulnerabilities, its hidden structures. The next morning, Daichi walked into a police station in Shibuya. Alone. He brought documents, account numbers, names of people his father had ordered killed, locations of weapons caches, details of money laundering operations that stretched across 3 continents. He brought everything. The detective who interviewed him was a woman named Yamamoto, in her 50s, with the particular exhaustion that comes from chasing Yakuza for 20 years and rarely winning. She listened to Daichi's testimony, delivered through a sign language interpreter, with the expression of someone who had just won the lottery. "Your father will know it was you," she said when he finished. It wasn't a question. Daichi nodded. "He'll try to have you killed." Another nod. "Why are you doing this?" Daiichi took a long time to answer. Finally, he signed. Because I want to be someone different. Because someone showed me that silence doesn't have to be a weapon. Because I'm tired of being a tool. Detective Yamamoto arranged protective custody immediately. Daiichi was moved to a safe house in Yokohama, a nondescript apartment in a nondescript building. He was told he couldn't contact anyone. No phone calls, no messages, no contact with the outside world until the trial was over. He lasted 4 days before he broke. He called Sakura from a phone the detective provided, a burner that couldn't be traced. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been holding the phone, waiting. "Where are you?" she whispered. "Safe. For now. I can't tell you where. It's better if you don't know." "When will I see you again?" "I don't know. Maybe never." "My father." "I know what your father will do," Sakura interrupted. Detective Yamamoto came to the restaurant. "She told me everything. She said I should leave the city, that I might be in danger because of my connection to you." Daiichi's chest tightened. "Did you?" "No," Sakura said simply. "I quit my job, and I rented a small apartment. I'm waiting for you. I don't care how long it takes." "Sakura, you don't understand. My father has already put out a contract. There are people looking for me. If they find you, then they find me," Sakura said, and there was steel in her voice that Daiichi had never heard before. "But I'm not running. I'm not hiding. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life wondering what if. I've done that my whole life, Daiichi. I've been invisible and quiet and small, and it never protected me from anything. It just made me disappear." Daiichi could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, could almost feel her presence through the phone. "I love you," Sakura said. "I know we haven't known each other very long. I know this is insane. But I love you, and I'm not going anywhere." For the first time in his life, Daiichi felt something like hope. It was terrifying and fragile and absolutely real. "I love you too," he signed, even though she couldn't see him. "I'm sorry I'm dragging you into this." "You're not dragging me anywhere," Sakura said. "I'm choosing this. I'm choosing you. That's the difference." The trial lasted 6 months. Daiichi testified via closed-circuit television, his image projected into the courtroom while he remained in a secure location. He watched his father's face on a monitor as he described in meticulous detail the crimes Masaru had committed. He saw the moment his father understood that his own son had destroyed him. Masaru's expression didn't change. That was perhaps the most chilling part. He simply looked at Daiichi with something that might have been respect, or might have been the recognition of a worthy opponent. Then he looked away and never looked at his son again. The verdict came on a Tuesday in autumn. Guilty on 43 counts. Life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The Yakuza organization fractured immediately, torn apart by internal power struggles and police raids that followed Daiichi's testimony. The empire Masaru had spent 40 years building collapsed in 6 months. Daiichi was released from protective custody on a Thursday. Detective Yamamoto drove him to Sakura's apartment herself, a small gesture of kindness that Daiichi would never forget. When Sakura opened the door, she was crying. Daiichi signed, "Don't cry, I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere." She pulled him inside and held him like he might disappear. They stood in her tiny apartment surrounded by the ordinary things of ordinary life. Books on shelves, plants on windowsills, the smell of tea and something floral. And for the first time, Daiichi understood what it meant to come home. But redemption, as it turned out, was more complicated than simply walking away from violence. The Yakuza didn't forget. They didn't forgive. And they certainly didn't accept that the boss's son had betrayed them without consequences. 3 weeks after Daiichi's release, someone tried to burn down Sakura's apartment building. The fire started in the basement, in the electrical room. It was clearly arson. Sakura and Daiichi escaped through a back stairwell. But the message was unmistakable. They weren't safe. They would never be safe. Detective Yamamoto helped them relocate to Nagasaki, a city far enough from Tokyo that the Yakuza's reach was weaker, though never completely absent. Daiichi found work at a small fishing company, using a false name, keeping his head down. Sakura found a job at a library where the quiet suited her perfectly. They rented a small house near the water. It had a garden that needed work and a roof that leaked when it rained. It was the most beautiful place Daichi had ever lived. But the past has a way of catching up. 6 months into their new life, Daichi received a letter. No return address. Just his name, written in careful kanji. Inside was a single photograph. Sakura, taken from a distance, walking home from work. On the back, a message in his father's handwriting. I can reach you anytime. Remember that. Daichi's hands shook as he held the photograph. The message was clear. Masaru might be in prison, but his reach extended beyond those walls. He had people on the outside. He had resources. He had patience. That night, Daichi told Sakura everything. He told her about the photograph, about his father's message, about the reality that they could never truly escape. So what do we do? Sakura asked, and her voice was steady. She had grown stronger in the months they'd been together. Or perhaps she'd always been strong and had simply been waiting for a reason to show it. Daichi signed, we stop running. We stop hiding. We live. We build something real. And if they come for us, we face it together. Together, Sakura repeated. She took his hand and placed it over her heart. Always together. The next year was the happiest and most terrifying of Daichi's life. He and Sakura got married in a small ceremony at the local shrine, with only Detective Yamamoto and a handful of trusted friends present. Sakura wore a simple white dress instead of a traditional wedding kimono, a quiet rebellion against expectation. Daichi wore a suit and signed his vows so beautifully that even Detective Yamamoto cried. I promise to protect you, he signed. Not from danger, because danger will always find us. But I promise to face it with you. I promise to never be silent about my love for you. I promise to spend every day becoming someone worthy of your choice. Sakura's vows were simpler, but no less profound. I promise to listen, to really listen, to hear not just your words, but your silence, to love you not despite your past, but including it. Because you are not your father's son. You are your own man, and I choose you. Every single day. They bought the house they'd been renting. Daichi started a small business teaching sign language to children, working with schools and community centers. It was honest work, meaningful work. Sakura continued at the library where she'd been promoted to head librarian. They built a life that was quiet and real and theirs. But they never forgot about the photograph. Daichi kept it, hidden away. A reminder that the past was always watching. Then, 2 years after they'd moved to Nagasaki, something unexpected happened. Daichi received a visitor at his sign language school. A man in his 60s, with the particular bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime in the Yakuza. He introduced himself as Tanaka, said he was an old associate of Masaru's. Daichi's first instinct was to call the police. Instead, he signed, What do you want? To deliver a message, Tanaka said. From your father. Daichi's hands clenched into fists. Tanaka continued, Masaru is dying. Cancer. The prison doctors give him 6 months, maybe less. He's been thinking about his life, about you, about the choices he made. I don't care. Daichi signed harshly. He knew you'd say that, Tanaka said. He pulled out a letter, sealed with wax. He asked me to give you this. He said you don't have to read it. He said if you throw it away, he'll understand. But he wanted you to have the choice. Daichi stared at the letter for a long moment. Then he took it. That night, he and Sakura sat in their garden, watching the sun set over the water. Daichi held the letter in his hands, unopened. Do you want to read it? Sakura asked softly. Daichi was quiet for a long time. Finally, he opened the envelope. His father's handwriting was shaky, the writing of a man whose hands were failing him. The letter was short. My son, I have spent my life building empires and breaking men. I have been very good at both. But I have been a terrible father. I know this now, at the end, when it's too late to change anything. I made you into a weapon because I didn't know how to make you into a son. I taught you violence because it was the only language I spoke. I confined you to silence because I was afraid of what you might say if you could speak. But you found your own language. You found someone who understood your silence and made it beautiful. I am proud of you. I am ashamed of myself. These two things are both true. I won't ask for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that you were right to leave. You were right to betray me. You were right to choose love over loyalty to a man like me. Live well. Love that woman with everything you have. Build the life I never could. That is the only redemption I can give you now. Your father. Masaru Daichi read the letter 3 times. On the third reading, tears fell onto the paper, smudging the ink. Sakura held him while he cried, not for his father, but for the boy he had been, the boy who had been forced into silence and violence and had somehow survived it. "What are you going to do?" Sakura asked. Daichi thought about it for a long time. Then he signed. "I'm going to visit him. One last time. I'm going to tell him that I forgive him. Not because he deserves it, but because I need to. Because holding on to anger is just another way of staying trapped in his world." "I'll come with you," Sakura said. "No," Daichi signed. "This is something I need to do alone, but I'll come back to you. I promise." The prison visit was arranged through Detective Yamamoto. Daichi sat across from his father in a visiting room, separated by reinforced glass. Masaru looked smaller than Daichi remembered, diminished by age and illness. His hands shook as he picked up the phone. "You came," Masaru said. His voice was hoarse, damaged by time and cigarettes and the weight of his own choices. Daichi picked up the phone on his side and signed, knowing his father couldn't understand sign language, but hoping somehow the meaning would reach him anyway. "I came to tell you that I forgive you, not for what you did to me, but for what you did to yourself. You were trapped too, father. In your own world, your own silence, your own violence. I'm sorry I couldn't save you from that." Masaru watched his son's hands move, watched the shapes his fingers made in the air. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. He understood that his son had become something he never could be. Free. "I'm proud of you," Masaru said again. "I know I said it in the letter, but I needed to say it to your face. I needed you to know that the man you became, the choices you made, they were right. They were always right." Daichi nodded. He set down the phone and pressed his hand against the glass. His father did the same, their palms meeting across the barrier that separated them. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. It was something more complicated than that. It was acknowledgement. It was the recognition that both of them had been prisoners. Daichi in his father's world, Masaru in his own, and only one of them had managed to escape. Masaru died 3 months later. Daichi didn't go to the funeral. Instead, he and Sakura spent the day in their garden, planting new flowers. They worked in silence, the comfortable silence of two people who understood each other perfectly. When they finished, Sakura took Daichi's hand and signed, her movements now fluent and beautiful. "He's gone now. You're free." Daichi looked at their garden, at the flowers they'd planted together, at the life they'd built from nothing but love and choice, and the willingness to be vulnerable with another person. "I was free the moment you sat beside me in that restaurant," he signed. "I just didn't know it yet." 5 years passed. 5 years of mornings waking up beside Sakura, of teaching children to sign, of building a life so ordinary it felt like a miracle. 5 years of safety, or at least the illusion of it. Daichi had learned that redemption wasn't a destination you reached and then stayed at forever. It was a daily choice, made over and over again, sometimes easier and sometimes impossibly hard. The Yakuza didn't forget about him. They couldn't afford to. He was the man who had brought down one of the most powerful organizations in Japan. He was a cautionary tale, a warning about what happened when loyalty fractured. But with Masaru dead and the organization scattered, the immediate threat had faded into something more abstract, a constant low-level danger rather than an active hunt. Still, Daichi never completely relaxed. He couldn't. The part of him that had been forged in violence, that had learned to read threats in the smallest gestures, never fully went away. He would notice when the same car appeared twice on their street. He would memorize the faces of people who lingered too long near Sakura's library. He would wake in the middle of the night, certain he'd heard something, and spend hours checking locks and windows. Sakura understood. She never complained about his vigilance, never tried to convince him that he was being paranoid. She simply lived alongside his caution, the way she lived alongside everything else about him, with acceptance and love. But 5 years of constant alertness takes a toll. It wears you down in ways that aren't visible on the surface. Daichi began to have nightmares again, dreams where he was back in his father's world, where his hands were instruments of violence and his silence was a weapon. He would wake up gasping, and Sakura would hold him until the panic subsided. One evening, after a particularly bad nightmare, Sakura asked him something she'd never asked before. "Do you regret it? Testifying against your father? Betraying the Yakuza?" Daichi was quiet for a long time. They were lying in bed, the darkness around them complete except for the faint glow of the city beyond their window. He signed slowly, his hands moving through the darkness. "Every day, and never. Both things are true." "What do you mean?" Sakura whispered. "I regret the violence I caused by testifying. I regret the lives that were disrupted, the families that were destroyed. I regret that my choice had consequences for people who didn't deserve them." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But I don't regret choosing you. I don't regret choosing to stop being a weapon. I don't regret becoming myself." Sakura reached over and found his hand in the darkness. "That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me." "There's something else," Daichi signed. "Something I've never told you." He could feel Sakura tense beside him. "What?" "When I was in protective custody, waiting for the trial, I thought about killing myself. I thought about how much easier it would be to just disappear, to stop existing. Because I knew that no matter what I did, no matter how far I ran, I would always be my father's son. I would always be the man who hurt people. I would always be marked by violence." Sakura's grip on his hand tightened. "But then I thought about you," Daichi continued. "I thought about your hands moving in sign language, about how you looked at me like I was worth saving, and I realized that suicide would be just another act of violence. It would be violence against you, against the life we could build together. So I chose to live. I chose to keep living, every single day, even when it's hard." "I'm glad," Sakura said, and she was crying. "I'm so glad." They held each other in the darkness, and Daichi felt something shift inside him. Not healing exactly. Healing implied that the wound would eventually close, would become a scar, and then fade. But what was happening was different. He was learning to live with the wound, to carry it without letting it define him. He was learning that redemption wasn't about becoming a different person. It was about accepting who you were and choosing to be better anyway. The trouble started on an ordinary Tuesday. Daichi was teaching a class of 8-year-olds sign language when Detective Yamamoto appeared in the doorway of the community center. She looked older than the last time he'd seen her, more worn down. She waited until the class ended, then pulled him aside. "We have a situation," she said without preamble. "One of the men you testified against, a Yakuza enforcer named Ishikawa, was released from prison yesterday. Early release for good behavior. He's already made threats against you." Daichi's hands clenched. "How specific?" "Very specific," Yamamoto said grimly. "He's told people he's going to make you suffer the way you made his organization suffer. He's talking about targeting your wife, making you watch, then finishing you off. It's not an idle threat. Ishikawa is serious. What do you recommend?" Daichi signed, though he already knew the answer. "Protective custody again, or relocation, somewhere far enough away that he can't find you." Daichi shook his head. "No. I'm done running. I'm done hiding." "Then you're going to die," Yamamoto said flatly. "And probably your wife too. Is that what you want?" "No," Daichi signed, "but I won't spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. I won't let fear dictate my choices anymore. That's what my father did, and it destroyed him." Yamamoto stared at him for a long moment. Then she sighed. "You're as stubborn as your father. I'll increase patrols in your neighborhood. I'll make sure we have eyes on Ishikawa. But Daichi, you need to be careful. This man is dangerous. I know, Daichi signed. I know exactly how dangerous he is. I made him dangerous. That night, Daichi told Sakura everything. She listened without interrupting, her face growing paler as he signed through the details. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. We should leave, she finally said. We should go somewhere he can't find us. Would you want to? Daichi asked. Would you want to spend the rest of your life running? No, Sakura admitted. But I also don't want to spend the rest of my life as a widow. Then we face this together, Daichi signed. We don't run, we don't hide. We live our lives, and if he comes for us, we deal with it. That's not a plan, Sakura said, her voice rising. That's just waiting to be attacked. It's more than that, Daichi signed. It's refusing to let him control us. It's choosing to live instead of choosing to survive. There's a difference. Sakura stood up and walked to the window, looking out at their garden, at the life they'd built. I'm scared, she said quietly. Daichi came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her. I'm scared too, he signed against her shoulder. But I'm more scared of what happens if we give in to fear. I'm more scared of becoming the kind of person who runs from his own past. What if he kills you? Sakura turned to face him, and there were tears streaming down her face. Then you'll know that I died choosing to be free, Daichi signed. That I died as myself, not as my father's weapon. That I died loving you. That's a good death. That's a redemption. Sakura pulled him close and held him like she could keep him safe through sheer force of will. I love you, she whispered. I love you so much it terrifies me. I know, Daichi signed. I love you too. That's why I can't run. Because you deserve someone who stands and fights for the life you've built together. Ishikawa came 3 weeks later. Daichi was closing up his sign language school when he saw the car pull up outside. 3 men got out, and he recognized Ishikawa immediately. A broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw. The scar that Daichi had given him years ago when they were both different people. Daichi's first instinct was to run, to call the police, to do anything except what he actually did, which was to walk outside and face them. Ishikawa, he signed, knowing the man couldn't understand but hoping the gesture would communicate something anyway. Ishikawa smiled, and it was the smile of a predator. The mute boy. I've been looking forward to this. He pulled out a knife, and his 2 companions moved to flank him. This was it, Daichi thought. This was the moment where his past finally caught up with him. This was the price of redemption. But then, something unexpected happened. Sakura appeared from inside the school building. She was holding her phone, and her voice was steady as she spoke. I've called the police. They're on their way. If you heard him, I have everything recorded on video. It was a bluff. The phone wasn't recording anything, but Ishikawa didn't know that. You think I care about the police? Ishikawa snarled. I've spent 10 years in prison. What's a few more? Maybe not, Sakura said, and she stepped forward to stand beside Daichi. But you care about your family. Detective Yamamoto told us that your daughter just got accepted to university, that she's planning to study medicine, that she has a scholarship that could be taken away if her father is convicted of attempted murder, that she could lose everything because of you. Ishikawa's face darkened with rage, but there was something else there too. Uncertainty. My husband testified against your organization, Sakura continued, her voice still steady even though Daichi could see her hands shaking. He did it because he wanted to be free. He did it because he wanted to build a life with me. He did it because he was brave enough to admit that he was wrong. But he's not the man you remember. He's not your enemy anymore. He's just a man trying to live quietly and teach children to sign. And if you hurt him, you'll be throwing away your daughter's future for revenge. Is that really what you want? For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Ishikawa lowered the knife. You're lucky, he said to Daichi. You're lucky that I have something to lose now. But don't think this is over. Don't think you're forgiven. I don't expect forgiveness, Daichi signed, even though Ishikawa couldn't understand. I just expect to live. Ishikawa and his men got back in the car and drove away. Sirens could be heard in the distance, growing closer. Sakura collapsed against Daichi, her legs giving out from the adrenaline crash. That was the stupidest thing I've ever done, she whispered. It was the bravest thing I've ever seen, Daichi signed, holding her up. When the police arrived, they found Daichi and Sakura standing in the middle of the street, holding each other, both of them shaking. Detective Yamamoto pulled up a few minutes later, and when she saw them, she looked like she might cry. I told you to be careful, she said. We were, Daichi signed. We were very careful. Ishikawa was arrested the next day. The attempted assault charge was added to his record, and his parole was revoked. He would spend another 10 years in prison. His daughter would go to university on her scholarship, and she would never know how close she came to losing everything because of her father's need for revenge. In the weeks that followed, Daichi found himself thinking a lot about cycles, about how violence begets violence, how revenge perpetuates itself across generations, how the only way to break the cycle is to refuse to participate in it. Ishikawa had wanted to hurt him, to make him suffer, to pass on the pain that had been inflicted on him. But Daichi had refused, and in refusing, he had broken something, not just for himself and Sakura, but potentially for Ishikawa's daughter too, who would now have a chance at a life untainted by her father's violence. That was redemption, Daichi realized. It wasn't about being forgiven. It wasn't about erasing the past or pretending it never happened. Redemption was about choosing, every single day, to be better than your circumstances. It was about refusing to pass on the pain. It was about breaking cycles instead of perpetuating them. A year later, Daichi and Sakura received an unexpected letter. It was from Ishikawa's daughter, written in careful handwriting. She was in her first year of medical school. She wrote that she had learned about her father's attempted assault, that she had learned about Daichi's testimony against the Yakuza, that she had learned about the man her father had tried to kill. She wrote, I want to apologize for what my father tried to do. I want to thank you for not retaliating, for not continuing the cycle of violence. I want you to know that because of your choice to forgive, I was able to pursue my dreams. I'm going to be a doctor. I'm going to help people. And I owe that to you. Daichi read the letter 3 times, and each time he cried. Sakura held him and didn't ask why. She understood that sometimes tears weren't about sadness. Sometimes they were about the weight of redemption finally becoming bearable. 7 years after Daichi's testimony, the Yakuza organization that his father had built had been completely dismantled. The men who had survived the initial police crackdown had either gone to prison or scattered to other organizations, other cities, other lives. The empire was gone, reduced to nothing but court documents and newspaper archives, and the memories of people who had lived through its violence. Daichi didn't follow the news about the organization's collapse. He tried not to think about it at all. But information has a way of finding you, especially when you're connected to it as intimately as he was. Detective Yamamoto would occasionally mention something. Another arrest, another conviction, another piece of the puzzle falling into place. Each piece was a consequence of his testimony, a ripple spreading outward from the choice he'd made to betray his father. By the 7th year, Daichi had learned to live with the weight of those consequences. But learning to live with something and being at peace with it were 2 different things. He was 35 years old now. Sakura was 33. They had been married for 6 years, and they had recently made a decision that terrified and thrilled them in equal measure. They were going to try to have a child. Are you sure? Sakura asked one evening as they lay in bed, discussing the future. Are you sure you want to bring a child into this? Into a life where your past could still catch up with us? I'm not sure about anything, Daichi signed. But I know that I want to build a family with you. I know that I want to show a child what it means to choose love over violence, to choose redemption over revenge. I know that I want to break the cycle completely. What if we can't? Sakura asked. What if we try and nothing happens? Then we'll have tried, Daichi signed. And that will be enough. But something did happen. 3 months later, Sakura discovered she was pregnant. The joy was immediate and overwhelming, but so was the fear. Daiichi found himself spiraling into anxiety in ways he hadn't experienced since the early days of their relationship. He began researching obstetrics, reading everything he could about pregnancy complications. He started having nightmares again, not about violence this time, but about losing Sakura, about something going wrong, about being unable to protect his child from a world that had already proven itself capable of tremendous cruelty. Sakura noticed, of course. She always noticed. "Talk to me," she said one night, finding him sitting on the porch at 3 a.m, staring out at the darkness. "I'm afraid," Daiichi signed. "I'm afraid that I'll be a terrible father. I'm afraid that my past will somehow poison my child. I'm afraid that I don't know how to be anything except what my father made me." Sakura sat down beside him and took his hand. "Your father made you into a weapon, but you unmade yourself. You chose to become something different. That's what you'll teach our child. That we're not defined by where we come from or what we've done. We're defined by the choices we make every single day." "What if I fail?" Daiichi signed. "Then you'll try again tomorrow," Sakura said simply. "That's what love is, Daiichi. It's not about being perfect. It's about showing up, every single day, and trying." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Sakura glowed in a way that made Daiichi's chest ache with love and gratitude. He attended every prenatal appointment, learning to sign with the midwife so he could be fully present in the process. He read books about fatherhood, though most of them felt useless. How could any book prepare you for the responsibility of raising a human being, of shaping a life that would carry your legacy into the future? But there was one book that struck him deeply. It was about breaking generational trauma, about how parents could choose to do things differently than their own parents had done. The author wrote about how the most powerful act of rebellion against a traumatic past was to love your children in the ways you wished you had been loved. Daiichi read that passage over and over again. He thought about his own childhood, about the absence of warmth, about the way his father had expressed love through control and violence. He thought about how he could be different, how he would be different. In the 8th month of pregnancy, Sakura went into premature labor. It was a Tuesday evening, and they were having dinner when she suddenly gasped and grabbed her stomach. Daiichi's first instinct was panic, but he forced himself to stay calm. He called the hospital, got her into the car, drove with careful precision, even though his hands were shaking. The labor was complicated. The baby was breech, and the doctors said they might need to do a cesarean section. Daiichi sat in the waiting room, unable to sign, unable to communicate, unable to do anything except wait. He thought about his father, about how Masaru had probably waited in a similar room when Daiichi was born. He wondered if his father had felt this same terror, this same helplessness. He wondered if his father had loved him, even then, before the violence and control had corrupted everything. After 6 hours, a doctor came out and told him that both mother and baby were healthy. It was a girl. 6 pounds, 3 ounces. Perfect. Daiichi cried in a way he hadn't cried since his father's death. He cried with relief and joy and the overwhelming realization that his life had just fundamentally changed. He was a father now. He was responsible for another human being, for shaping her future, for teaching her what it meant to be loved. When he was finally allowed to see Sakura and the baby, he found his wife exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny infant with dark hair and her mother's delicate features. Sakura looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "Meet Yuki," she said softly. "Our daughter." Daiichi approached slowly, reverently, as if approaching something sacred. He reached out and gently touched the baby's face, and Yuki opened her eyes and looked directly at him. In that moment, something shifted in Daiichi's chest. The weight he'd been carrying for so long, the weight of his past, his violence, his shame, didn't disappear, but it transformed into something else. It became purpose. It became love. "Hello, Yuki," he signed, even though she couldn't understand. "I'm your father. I promise to love you. I promise to protect you. I promise to be better than I was yesterday." The first year of Yuki's life was the hardest and most beautiful year of Daiichi's life. He learned to change diapers and warm bottles. He learned to recognize the different cries that meant hunger versus discomfort versus tiredness. He learned that fatherhood was a constant negotiation between exhaustion and joy, between fear and wonder. And he learned something else. He learned that he was capable of love in a way that didn't involve control or violence. He learned that you could be strong and gentle simultaneously. He learned that vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was the foundation of real connection. Sakura returned to work part-time at the library when Yuki was 3 months old, and Daiichi became the primary caregiver. He brought Yuki to his sign language classes, and the children were fascinated by the baby. He taught them how to sign to her, how to communicate with her, even though she couldn't sign back yet. He was building a community, he realized. He was creating a world where silence wasn't something to fear or hide from, but something to celebrate and understand. When Yuki was 6 months old, Detective Yamamoto came to visit. She brought a gift, a small stuffed animal, and she held the baby with the tenderness of someone who had spent her life dealing with violence and had learned to treasure moments of peace. "She's beautiful," Yamamoto said, watching as Yuki grabbed at her fingers. "She looks like her mother." "I hope so," Daiichi signed. "I hope she gets nothing from me except my stubbornness." "That's not true," Yamamoto said, and there was something knowing in her eyes. "She'll get your capacity for change, your ability to choose redemption. Those are the things that matter." After Yamamoto left, Daiichi found himself thinking about legacy. His father's legacy was violence and control, and an empire built on the suffering of others. But Daiichi's legacy could be different. His legacy could be a daughter who grew up in a home filled with love. His legacy could be a community of children learning to communicate in new ways. His legacy could be the breaking of cycles, the refusal to perpetuate pain. When Yuki was 1 year old, something unexpected happened. Daiichi received a letter from the prison where his father had died. It was from the warden, explaining that they had found some personal effects in Masaru's cell that they wanted to return to his family. Among them was a journal, a small leather-bound notebook that Masaru had kept during his final years in prison. Daiichi almost threw it away without reading it, but something made him open it. Something made him read the careful handwriting of a man confronting his own mortality and his own failures. The journal was filled with reflections on Masaru's life. There were entries about his childhood, about the poverty and violence he'd grown up with. There were entries about the moment he'd decided to join the Yakuza, about the first man he'd killed, about the slow erosion of his humanity as he climbed higher in the organization. There were entries about Daiichi's mother, about how much he'd loved her, and how little he'd known how to show it. There were entries about Daiichi himself, about the guilt Masaru felt for the way he'd raised his son, about the pride he felt watching Daiichi become strong, about the horror he felt realizing that strength had been twisted into violence. But the final entries were different. They were written in the last months of Masaru's life, as the cancer ate away at him and he faced the reality of his own mortality. In these entries, Masaru wrote about redemption, not his own, which he believed was impossible, but Daiichi's. He wrote about how his son had done what Masaru could never do. He had chosen to be free. He had chosen to break the cycle. He had chosen love over loyalty to a corrupt system. The final entry was dated 3 days before Masaru's death. "I will die in this cell, and I will die knowing that I failed in almost every way that matters. I failed as a husband. I failed as a father. I failed as a human being. But my son succeeded where I failed. He became what I could never be, a man capable of genuine love. If there is any redemption in my life, it is that I created the circumstances that forced him to become better than me. If there is any meaning to my suffering, it is that it taught him what not to do. I am proud of him. I am ashamed of myself, and I am grateful that he will not repeat my mistakes." Daiichi read the journal 3 times, and each time he wept. Not for his father. He had made peace with Masaru's death years ago, but for the man his father might have been if circumstances had been different. If he had been born into a different family, a different world. If he had had the courage to choose differently. That night, Daiichi held Yuki while she slept, and he made a silent promise to his father's memory. He promised that he would use his father's mistakes as a blueprint for how not to live. He promised that he would teach Yuki about love and choice and the power of redemption. He promised that the cycle would end with him, that his daughter would grow up in a world free from the violence that had defined his own childhood. When Yuki was 2 years old, she said her first word. It wasn't mama or dada. It was a sign. She reached up and made the sign for love, her small hand moving in the shape of a heart across her chest. She was signing to her father, communicating in the language of silence that had become the language of their family. Daichi felt something break open inside him. Not in a painful way, but in a way that felt like healing. He realized that his daughter would grow up in a world where silence wasn't something to be ashamed of or afraid of. She would grow up understanding that there were many ways to communicate, many ways to express love, many ways to be heard. He signed back, "I love you too, Yuki. I love you so much." And in that moment, in the simple exchange of signs between a father and daughter, Daichi understood what redemption truly meant. It wasn't about erasing the past or pretending it never happened. It wasn't about being forgiven by the people you'd hurt, or forgetting the people you'd harmed. Redemption was about taking the broken pieces of your life and using them to build something beautiful. It was about choosing every single day to be better than you were yesterday. It was about breaking cycles and creating new ones. Cycles of love instead of violence, of communication instead of silence, of hope instead of despair. On Yuki's 3rd birthday, Daichi and Sakura threw a small party in their garden. Detective Yamamoto came, and so did some of Daichi's students and their families. The garden was filled with the sound of children laughing, with the sight of small hands making signs, with the warmth of community and connection. As Daichi watched his daughter blow out the candles on her cake, he thought about the boy he had been, the mute enforcer, the weapon, the man trapped in his father's world. He thought about how far he had come, how much he had changed, how completely his life had been transformed by one moment of vulnerability, by one woman who had sat beside him and spoken in signs. Sakura came and stood beside him, slipping her hand into his. She didn't need to speak. After all these years, they had developed their own language, a language of touch and presence and the kind of understanding that transcended words. "Thank you," Daichi signed with his free hand, looking at his wife. "For what?" Sakura asked softly. "For seeing me, for loving me, for teaching me that silence could be beautiful." Sakura smiled, and it was the same smile that had stopped him from destroying a man in a restaurant years ago. It was the smile that had saved his life. "Thank you for choosing to live," she said. "Thank you for choosing us." That night, after Yuki was asleep and the house was quiet, Daichi sat in the garden with Sakura. They didn't talk. They didn't need to. They simply sat together in the darkness, holding hands, listening to the sound of the city beyond their small sanctuary. Daichi thought about cycles and redemption and the power of choice. He thought about his father, about Ishikawa, about all the men he had hurt in his years as an enforcer. He thought about the fact that he could never undo those things, could never truly make amends for the violence he had committed. But he could choose to be different going forward. He could choose to teach his daughter that violence was never the answer. He could choose to build a life based on love instead of fear. And in the end, that was enough. Not perfect, not complete, but enough. The weight of his past would never completely disappear. It would always be there. A shadow at the edge of his consciousness, a reminder of who he had been and what he had done. But it no longer defined him. It no longer controlled him. It had become, instead, a teacher, a harsh but necessary teacher that had shown him what he never wanted to be again. Redemption, Daichi understood now, wasn't about becoming innocent. It was about becoming responsible. It was about acknowledging your sins and choosing, every single day, to be better. It was about building something beautiful from the ruins of your past. And as he sat in the garden with the woman he loved, listening to the sound of their daughter sleeping peacefully inside, Daichi felt something he had never thought possible. He felt at peace. 10 years after Daichi first testified against his father, the world had moved on. The Yakuza organization that had once seemed so permanent, so inevitable, had become nothing more than a historical footnote. New organizations had risen to take its place. New crimes had captured the public's attention. The story of Masaru's fall and his son's betrayal had faded from the news cycle, replaced by fresher scandals and newer tragedies. But for Daichi, the past was never truly past. It lived in his body, in the way his hands sometimes trembled when he was stressed, in the nightmares that still occasionally woke him in the middle of the night, in the hypervigilance that had become so ingrained in him that he barely noticed it anymore. The past was the architecture of his present, the foundation upon which everything he had built rested. Yuki was now 10 years old. She was a bright, curious child who loved books and art, and spending time in her father's sign language school. She was fluent in both spoken Japanese and sign language, moving fluidly between the two worlds in a way that neither of her parents could quite manage. She had her mother's gentleness and her father's intensity, a combination that made her both vulnerable and remarkably resilient. Daichi had never told Yuki the full story of his past. He had told her that her grandfather had been a bad man, that her father had made difficult choices to protect their family, that sometimes doing the right thing meant sacrificing things you loved. But he hadn't told her about the violence, about the years as an enforcer, about the blood on his hands that no amount of time could wash away. He knew that day was coming, though. Yuki was old enough now to start asking harder questions, to start understanding that her father's past was more complicated than the sanitized version she'd been given. And Daichi was terrified of that conversation, in a way he had never been terrified of physical danger. The catalyst came on a Tuesday afternoon, when Yuki came home from school with a project assignment. She was studying modern Japanese history, and her teacher had asked the students to research significant criminal cases from the past 20 years. Yuki had chosen to research the fall of the Yamamoto organization, not because she knew it was connected to her father, but because the case had been so high-profile, so dramatic, so perfect for a school project. She came to Daichi with her research materials spread across the kitchen table, her eyes bright with the excitement of discovery. "Dad, look at this," she said, pointing to a newspaper article from 15 years ago. This Yakuza boss, Masaru Yamamoto, was brought down by his own son testifying against him. The son was mute, so he had to communicate through a sign language interpreter. Isn't that incredible? I mean, imagine having the courage to betray your own father like that. Imagine choosing justice over family loyalty. Daichi felt the world tilt slightly. He sat down slowly, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "Dad?" Yuki looked at him with concern. "Are you okay? You look pale." "I need to tell you something," Daichi signed slowly. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." Yuki's expression shifted from excitement to worry. She set down her research materials and came to sit beside him. "That man," Daichi signed, pointing to the photograph of Masaru in the newspaper. "That's my father. Your grandfather." Yuki's eyes widened. "Wait, what? But you said your father was… I mean, you never really talked about him much, but I thought…" "I know," Daichi signed. "I protected you from the truth because I was ashamed. I was ashamed of who I was, of what I had done, of the family I came from." For the next 3 hours, Daichi told Yuki the truth. He told her about his childhood, about being forced into silence and violence, about becoming his father's weapon. He told her about the day he met Sakura, about how her mother had saved his life by speaking in signs. He told her about testifying against his father, about the years in protective custody, about the constant threat of retaliation. He told her about Ishikawa, about the moment when violence could have consumed them all but didn't. He told her everything, holding nothing back. Yuki listened without interrupting, her young face growing more serious with each revelation. When Daichi finished, she was quiet for a long time. "So you killed people," she finally said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Daichi signed. "I hurt people. I destroyed lives. I was a weapon, and I was very good at what I was designed to do." "But you stopped," Yuki said. "You chose to stop." "Yes. And you testified against Grandpa, even though you knew he would try to kill you." "Yes." Yuki stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where she had spent so much of her childhood. When she turned back to face her father, there were tears on her cheeks, but her voice was steady. "I'm glad you did," she said. "I'm glad you testified. I'm glad you chose to be different. Because if you hadn't, I wouldn't exist. Mom and you wouldn't have found each other. I wouldn't be here." Daiichi felt something break open inside him, the same feeling he'd had when Yuki made her first sign, but deeper, more profound. His daughter understood. Not the full weight of his past, not yet. She was too young for that. But she understood the essential truth. That redemption was possible. That people could change. That the choices you made in the present could transform the trajectory of your entire life. "I'm sorry," Daiichi signed. "I'm sorry for the things I did. I'm sorry for the people I hurt." "You can't apologize to them," Yuki said with the brutal honesty of a 10-year-old. "But you can be good now. You can teach people. You can love Mom and me. You can make sure that what you did matters by making sure you never do it again." Daiichi pulled his daughter into his arms and held her, and he cried in a way he hadn't cried since the day she was born. He cried for the boy he had been, for the man he had become, for the father he was trying to be. He cried for all the people he had hurt, for all the lives he had damaged, for the violence that could never be undone. But he also cried with gratitude. Gratitude for Sakura, for Yuki, for the second chance he had been given, for the opportunity to build something beautiful from the wreckage of his past. After that conversation, something shifted in their family. Yuki began asking more questions about her grandfather, about the Yakuza, about the nature of redemption and forgiveness. Daiichi answered honestly, adapting his explanations to match her growing understanding. He didn't shield her from the darkness anymore. Instead, he helped her understand that darkness existed, that it was real, and that the most important thing was choosing to be a light in response to it. Sakura supported this process, recognizing that Yuki needed to understand her father's past in order to truly understand him. She helped Daiichi find the words, or rather the signs, to explain complex moral questions to their daughter. She reminded him that honesty, even when it was painful, was the foundation of real love. 6 months after Yuki's history project, Detective Yamamoto came to visit. She was retired now, spending her days gardening and occasionally consulting on cold cases. She brought Yuki a gift, a book about the history of the Japanese criminal justice system, and she sat in the garden with the family, drinking tea and watching Yuki play. "She's a remarkable child," Yamamoto said to Daiichi and Sakura. "She has your strength, Daiichi, but she also has something you had to learn. She has compassion. She understands that people are complicated." "How do you know that?" Daiichi sighed. "Because she asked me about your father," Yamamoto said. "She asked me what kind of man he was, whether he was all bad, or whether there were parts of him that were good. She asked me if I thought he was capable of redemption, even though he died before he could achieve it." Daiichi felt something shift in his chest. He had never thought about his father's potential for redemption. He had been so focused on his own redemption that he hadn't considered whether his father might have wanted the same thing. "I told her the truth," Yamamoto continued. "I told her that your father was a complicated man who made terrible choices, but I also told her that in his final years, he seemed to understand what he had done wrong. I told her that redemption isn't always about being forgiven by the people you've hurt. Sometimes it's about understanding your own capacity for harm and choosing to be different anyway." After Yamamoto left, Daiichi found himself thinking about his father in a new way. Not with forgiveness, he wasn't sure he was capable of that, but with a kind of compassionate understanding. Masaru had been trapped in a world of violence just as surely as Daiichi had been. The difference was that Masaru had never found a way out. He had never met someone who spoke in signs and showed him that there was another way to live. That night, Daiichi wrote a letter to his father. It was something he had never done before, had never even considered doing. He wrote about his life now, about Sakura and Yuki, about the sign language school and the community he had built. He wrote about the choices he had made and the person he had become. He wrote about forgiveness. Not forgiving his father for what he had done, but forgiving himself for the man he had been. He never sent the letter. Instead, he burned it in the garden, watching the smoke rise into the night sky, carrying his words to a man who was long dead, but somehow still present in every choice Daiichi made. When Yuki turned 13, she asked to volunteer at her father's sign language school. Daiichi was hesitant at first. He wanted to protect her from the weight of his past, wanted to keep her separate from the world of sign language and deafness that had become so intertwined with his redemption. But Sakura encouraged him to let her try. "She needs to understand what you do," Sakura said. "She needs to see that your past has led to something good, something meaningful." So Yuki began volunteering, teaching younger children sign language alongside her father. She was a natural teacher, patient and creative, finding ways to make learning fun and accessible. She didn't know it, but she was carrying forward her grandmother's legacy. The grandmother she had never met. The deaf woman who had taught Sakura to sign, who had shown her that silence could be beautiful. One day, a young boy came to the school, a deaf child who had recently lost his hearing due to illness. He was angry and withdrawn, refusing to engage with the other children or the teachers. Daiichi recognized something in the boy's anger, something that reminded him of his own rage as a younger man. He tried to reach the boy, but nothing worked. The boy remained isolated, trapped in his own silence. Then Yuki approached him. She sat beside him without saying anything, without trying to force communication. She simply sat with him in his silence, and after a while, she began to sign. Not lessons, not instructions, but stories. She told him about her father, about how he had lived in silence for so long that he had forgotten how to speak. She told him about her mother, about how she had learned to listen to silence in a way that most people never could. She told him that silence wasn't a prison, it was just a different way of being in the world. The boy didn't respond at first, but over the course of several weeks, something shifted. He began to engage with Yuki, began to learn sign language, began to understand that his deafness didn't make him broken or incomplete. He began to build a life within his silence instead of fighting against it. Watching his daughter work with that boy, Daiichi understood something profound about redemption. It wasn't a destination you reached and then stayed at forever. It was a process, a constant unfolding, a way of being in the world that you had to choose over and over again. And the most powerful redemption wasn't the one you achieved for yourself. It was the one you helped others achieve. When Yuki turned 18, she announced that she wanted to study deaf education in university. She wanted to become a teacher, to work with deaf children and help them navigate a world that wasn't always designed with them in mind. Daiichi felt a profound sense of pride and gratitude. His daughter was taking the language of silence that had saved his life and using it to save other lives. On the day Yuki left for university, Daiichi and Sakura drove her to the train station. The three of them stood on the platform, and Daiichi signed to his daughter. "I'm proud of you. I'm so proud of who you've become." "I learned from the best," Yuki signed back. "I learned from a man who chose to be brave enough to change. I learned from a woman who was brave enough to love him. I learned that silence can be a gift, not a curse." She hugged them both, and then she was gone, disappearing into the train with her suitcases and her dreams and her own journey toward becoming who she was meant to be. On the drive home, Sakura reached over and took Daiichi's hand. "She's going to do amazing things," she said softly. "I know," Daiichi signed with his free hand. "She's already doing amazing things. She's breaking cycles. She's building a world where silence is understood instead of feared." 20 years after Daiichi first testified against his father, he received an unexpected visitor. It was a woman in her early 50s, with kind eyes and a familiar face. She introduced herself as Keiko, and she explained that she was the sister of one of the men Daiichi had killed during his years as an enforcer. Daiichi's first instinct was fear. He thought this was retribution, that the past had finally caught up with him in a way that couldn't be escaped. But Keiko's expression was gentle, not angry. "I've spent 20 years hating you," she said. "I've spent 20 years thinking about what I would say if I ever got the chance to meet you. I've imagined confronting you, making you understand the pain you caused my family." Daiichi couldn't speak, couldn't sign. He could only wait for what came next. "But then I learned about what you did," Keiko continued. "I learned that you testified against your own father, that you spent years in protective custody, that you built a life based on redemption instead of revenge. And I realized something. My brother is still dead. Nothing I do will change that. But you chose to stop killing. You chose to build something beautiful instead of destroying things. And I think my brother would have wanted that. He would have wanted his death to mean something, to inspire change instead of more violence. She reached into her bag and pulled out a photograph. It was a picture of a young man, smiling at the camera. "This is my brother, Hiroshi. He was a good man. He made bad choices, but he was good. I wanted you to know his name. I wanted you to know that he was more than just a victim of your violence. He was a person. He mattered." Daiichi took the photograph with shaking hands. He looked at Hiroshi's face, at the smile that would never smile again because of choices Daiichi had made decades ago. And he wept. "I can't undo what I did," he signed through his tears. "I can't bring him back. I can't make it right." "I know," Keiko said, "but you can remember him. You can acknowledge that he mattered. You can make sure that your redemption includes honoring the people you hurt." After Keiko left, Daiichi placed Hiroshi's photograph on a shelf in his home, next to photographs of Sakura and Yuki and the life he had built. Every day, he would look at that photograph and remember. He would remember that redemption wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about honoring it, about acknowledging the people you had hurt, about carrying their memory forward as a reminder of who you never wanted to be again. On Daiichi's 50th birthday, his family threw him a party. Yuki was now a successful deaf education specialist, working with schools across Japan. She had published papers on sign language pedagogy and had become a recognized expert in her field. Sakura had been promoted to director of her library system. Detective Yamamoto, now in her 80s, came to the party in a wheelchair, but her mind was still sharp, her spirit still fierce. As Daiichi looked around at the people gathered in his garden, at his wife, his daughter, his friends, his students, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. Not gratitude for the life he had been born into, which had been filled with violence and control, but gratitude for the life he had chosen to build, for the second chances he had been given, for the people who had believed in him when he didn't believe in himself. That night, after everyone had left and the house was quiet, Daiichi sat in the garden with Sakura. They had been married for 24 years now, and they still sat together in silence the way they had when they first fell in love. "Do you ever regret it?" Sakura asked. "Do you ever wish you had made different choices?" Daiichi thought about the question carefully. He thought about his father, about the violence, about the years of being trapped in a world that had no room for love or gentleness or redemption. He thought about the moment Sakura had sat beside him in the restaurant and spoken in signs. He thought about all the choices that had led him to this moment, to this garden, to this life. "No," he finally signed. "I regret the violence I committed. I regret the people I hurt. But I don't regret the choices I made to change. I don't regret choosing you. I don't regret choosing redemption over revenge." "Even though it was hard?" Sakura asked. "Especially because it was hard," Daiichi signed. "The hardest things are always the most worth doing." Sakura leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat together in the darkness, listening to the sound of the city beyond their sanctuary. Daiichi thought about cycles and redemption, and the power of choice. He thought about how violence begets violence, but love begets love. He thought about how one person's choice to be different could ripple outward and transform entire lives. He thought about his father, about Ishikawa, about all the men he had hurt. He thought about Keiko and her brother Hiroshi. He thought about the young deaf boy who had learned to see his silence as a gift instead of a curse. He thought about all the lives that had been touched by his choice to testify, to betray his father, to choose redemption. And he understood, finally, what his father had written in that final journal entry. Redemption wasn't about being forgiven. It was about understanding your capacity for harm and choosing every single day to be better. It was about breaking cycles. It was about building something beautiful from the ruins of your past. It was about silence that spoke louder than any words ever could.